Welcome back, Principal Matters Podcast. We are episode 494, and I'm here with Will Parker. 494, Will. Crazy.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting
Ugh,
so close.
so
The
close.
vibe is
Okay,
good.
Mark Shellinger is our guest today. An awesome interview. Can't wait for you to hang out for that. But before we do that, we have our question of the week. And the question of the week is supported by Summer Pop's Math Workbooks. Principals, when students practice math over the summer, guess what? Math scores go up. So what is your summer math plan this year? A great way to start is by ordering free summer workbook samples at summerpopsworkbooks.com. So look there, and we kind of have a rule that whoever asks the question of the week does not have to answer first. And I want to answer first. So you are asking the question.
Okay, here's the question, Jen. It's that time of the year. What are some rules of thumb I should keep in mind if I'm on an interview committee?
So this is a softball to me because I've been thinking about this quite a bit.
Mhm.
Here's the number one thing I really want people to keep in mind if they're on an interview committee. You are an advisor. You are not a decider. I think. I mean, that's how most
So I do.
interview committees go. But
Yeah.
I see so many people get on interview committees and they think I gotta get what I want out of this. And we all will sometimes confuse that from being an advisor. And what that does is it changes your mindset because if you think you're a decider, you're going to say things that maybe you shouldn't say, maybe borderline on unprofessional because you want what you want, right? And you think you need to make your point. If you think of yourself as an advisor, I think you'll be much more careful in how you share your thoughts and how you feel after the interview committee wraps up.
Wow, Jen. I know we only have 5 minutes for this Q&A, so I'll try to say things really quickly. And
It's your fault. You brought this question. It's
I
your
did
fault.
because this is the time of the year, and so I've talked to so many people that are in the middle of just this very thing where they show up and then there's this huge panel of people in front of them, or they're on the panel of people. And so I just want to say a few things out loud that I think are important to remember if you're on the in the role of that interview committee, just like you said. And that first thing is just listen. Just be a good listener. Because if you come in with all of your opinions already formed, or you think you're going to try to form opinions about people before they've been heard, or if you've already made maybe your own personal choice because you are aware of who's getting ready to come in, then you're not doing the service of what Jen just said, which is being an advisor of among this group for the decision makers who are going to be making that decision, which may be you. You may be the decision maker in that group, but it may not be you. And Jen, I have such an embarrassing memory of being a first year, maybe, oh, I was probably a second or third year teacher. I was the youngest teacher on an interview committee. And I remember I look back at that now and I realized I was so embarrassed because I thought we were the deciders. I just thought, well, and I didn't understand the dynamics of advising so that a leader can make
Mhm.
the final decision. The second thing I would say is treat every single person who comes before that committee with the kind of dignity and respect you would want to receive, because guess what? Sometimes first choices don't say yes. Or sometimes that second or third choice may be the person that you end up working with. And you wanna make sure that your interaction with whoever is sitting around that table is the kind of working relationship you may want with that person later. Not to mention, the importance of treating every person who comes before you as a spokesperson for your team when they leave the meeting. How do I want these people talking back to the community and other communities about what it would be like to work for us or with us? And so, Jen, for me, this is a marketing opportunity. If I'm going to treat every person who comes to that committee um, as a potential work partner, but also as a potential spokesperson for when they walk away, then obviously, I'm gonna ask hard questions. I'm gonna do my due diligence and being transparent when they leave, but I'm also gonna make sure that I'm treating that situation. So I got one more thing to say, and that's you also have to protect confidentiality. When you sit on those committees, your goals should be the collective good, not to run out and quickly begin to gossip with everybody else about what you were learning in the meetings because you have the quote unquote power. And I'm saying that from some self-criticism when I was a young guy of thinking, um, about that position differently than I do now. So, I don't know if that.
Well, and to wrap up, just let let's remember too, it takes great courage to interview for anything.
Mhm.
And so you want to honor the fact that somebody was courageous enough to do it. And let's be careful that we don't forget it might be us someday. And we would want somebody to treat us with that dignity and respect for the courage. So,
It's so true.
yes, let's interview our guts out, but let's keep our wits about us as we do, please.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jen. Thanks for letting us bring this question. And today's guest is going to be somebody who I just believe Mark Shellinger epitomizes dignity and respect. I've known him now for more than 10 years. I've been able to work with him at the SAM National Innovation Conference that he hosts every year, and he's coming back for a second time in today's interview to talk about um, going even deeper when it comes to providing feedback to teachers and observations for principals. So, Principal Matters listeners, thank you for letting us do this Q&A with you. Jen, how can folks stay connected with you and your wonderful resources?
Yep. Find me at jenschwanke.com.
And you can find today's show notes at williamdparker.com. And I know you're going to enjoy Mark. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Why is IXL used in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts? Because it works. IXL is research proven to benefit all student populations, including English language learners and special education classrooms. IXL is an all-inclusive online learning and teaching solution for K-12 that accelerates achievement, saves teachers time, and more. This one platform helps you accomplish what normally would require dozens of other tools. For example, as students practice skills, IXL automatically differentiates learning to help them master concepts at their own pace. Teachers get real-time insights into how students are performing so they can provide timely support. What I love about IXL are the personalized SAT and ACT study plans. Students just need to enter the most recent test score, and IXL automatically generates a custom list of skills they should work on to improve their scores. Discover what IXL can do for your school. Visit IXL.com/PM today.
You're listening to Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast.
Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. And this week, I am in the room with a special guest, Mark Shellinger. Mark is a returning guest to Principal Matters. He's the founder and director of the National SAM Innovation Project, a nonprofit helping school leaders reclaim their time for what matters most, which is teaching and learning. Mark began his career as a teacher, later serving as a principal and superintendent before developing the SAM process in 2005, a system designed to help principals shift from managing tasks to leading instruction. Under his leadership, he now supports more than 1,200 schools across the country, giving leaders the tools and coaching they need to spend less time on paperwork and more time with people. And his passion is simple: helping every educator and every student thrive. Mark, welcome back to Principal Matters Podcast. You were a guest in September of 2024 for episode 414. Why don't you fill in the gaps on that intro and tell listeners something they may be surprised since the last time they met you?
Well, first, thanks for the nice introduction. Boy, I just like to record that and listen to it over and over again. Well, I guess I'll get to because I'm on your podcast. I'll be able to hear it. I like it. So what didn't I tell you before? Did you know that my first day as being a principal, I sat next to my father in the superintendent's conference room. He was the oldest principal, most veteran principal in the district, and I was the youngest. And there were 27 other principals there. And in walked the new superintendent, a really cool guy named Ken Burnley. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, as of today, you're all instructional leaders." This was 1982. And my dad turns to me and sotto voce says, "Only when you have time, Mark." And all 27 other principals broke out laughing. And I have to tell you, that really was where SAMS came from, because I wanted to be what Ken Burnley was describing, an instructional leader. But my dad was explaining what the culture is in districts and in schools back in 1982 and still today in many places. That really what most district leaders, like a superintendent or a board, are looking for is someone who's going to manage that school and make sure everything works. It really wasn't until 1982, and when Ken Burnley was saying you should be an instructional leader, he was actually kind of ahead of the game, because it wasn't until that year that you began seeing in the research, and educational research anyway, that a principal should be an instructional leader. And then as you move forward politically, principals were held accountable legally. And they were told to be a principal, you're going to be held accountable for student outcomes, which was really a radical idea when you think about it, because it never was what a principal was supposed to be. So I guess that's something you don't know about me. That
I didn't.
really the idea of SAMs happened that first year of being a principal, and then the next 10 years being a principal, I kept thinking about, am I really an instructional leader, or am I spending the majority of my day managing my school? And then
Well,
another 10 years being a superintendent, I felt guilty turning to a principal and say, you should be an instructional leader, because I wasn't sure I had been, and I wasn't sure it was possible. And that led to the Wallace Foundation saying, Mark, what would you like to do? And I said, I want to study whether it'd be possible to change the conditions in a school where a principal could be an instructional leader for the majority of the day. And that's how SAMS got started.
well, Mark, I love walking down memory lane with you. And so, just so Principal Matters listeners know, if you did not listen to Mark and I's episode 414, I really view Mark as a mentor in my work, and he has been a mentor for so many leaders. And if we want to walk down memory lane, Mark, that first year that you were doing research for the Wallace Foundation was my second year in school administration as an assistant principal. And fast forward, probably around 2011, 2012, somewhere around there, you reached out because you were in Oklahoma. You came up, you visited the school district where I was at the time a principal. Um, you showed us what processes you had created by that time with the SAM process of answering that challenge of helping leaders move from just managing time to instructional leadership. I've adopted so many of your practices. I've shared it with so many of the people that I train and work with. And I just consider it such an honor to be able to partner with you. And that's why I brought this full circle. A few weeks ago, at the time of this recording, I had sent you a podcast episode where you were mentioned in the episode and you were kind enough to listen. And then in Mark fashion, you sent me back an email that was so rich. I was like, "Nope, this has gotta be recorded." So, I asked you to step in because you took it really from part 1 of the process to part 2. Well, I don't know what part you wanna call this. It could be many of your parts, but specifically, you took me into a deeper talk about walkthroughs. And so, I wanted to start there. You've trained countless SAM teams across the nation. What do you think most leaders misunderstand about the purpose of walkthroughs and how they can make them more meaningful?
Well, I broadened it just a little bit to say that I think school leaders make the assumption that being in a classroom improves teacher practice. And that's faulty. There's no evidence of that. In fact, if you see any evidence at all, it shows that being in a classroom can hurt teaching practice, because really it can't help teaching practice unless it's connected with other things like feedback and professional development and rich conversation to help the teacher figure out how to be better. And there just isn't a recipe to do that. And so when you think about it, most principals confuse observation and a formal teaching, a formal evaluation system with improving practice. And I do a thing in every one of the training sessions when I'm working with a principal, and I'll have 30 principals, 30 SAMs in a room, and I'll say, raise your hand if you think your formal observation evaluation system improves teacher practice. I have done this for years. I've never had a single person raise their hand, because we all know intuitively it doesn't. And so we think, well, we have to do it. And then we make the mistake of convincing ourselves that this is our job as an instructional leader, doing this formal evaluation system. And we know it's not effective. And so really, we started doing observations where you go into a room and watch a teacher teach, and we confused it with improving teacher practice. And then we tried to think of, well, if this doesn't work, what might work? So some yahoos sometimes said, let's let the principal not be stuck in a room. Let's let them do a walkthrough. They can walk into the room, see what's going on, spend a few minutes, maybe leave a note, and then walk out. And what we did is we confused school leaders again, thinking, well, I'm doing my school leadership work. I'm having a positive impact. But the truth is, there's no evidence of that either. And so when we started doing the SAM work, which is all about intentionality, getting the principal to be thoughtful about what's your intention when you're going in to see a teacher teach? What is your intention and what's going to be your next step? We realized that we needed to broaden seeing instruction to go beyond a observation or a walkthrough, Band-Aids. And so we came up with two others. The first one was work with students. And I love work with students. And the reason I love it is everybody who does it loves it. It allows the principal to go into the room and say, Will, if you're the teacher, Will, I'm going to be here for the next 30 minutes watching you teach. Put me to work. I'd like to be your teaching assistant. Let me work with a student or teacher I can help you with. It changes the whole power dynamic in a dramatically important way. You know that old saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help? We do that as a joke. Now you're the principal and you're actually helping. That's a huge surprise to a lot of teachers. And here's what it does for the principal. It frees the principal to actually pay attention to the lesson. Will, you and I both know that as an educational leader, going into a classroom, sitting and watching, doing an observation or perhaps a walkthrough can be painful because in your head, you have two movies going on. One is all the things that could be going wrong out in your building because you're not there. The second is all the things you should be doing and you can't do because you're stuck right here. This allows the principal to actually focus, pay attention, be in the moment, be centered. It allows the principal to see the lesson in a different way. It allows the teacher to appreciate the fact they're actually getting assistance. And then the piece de resistance. When the principal does the follow-up conversation, the principal has something real to talk with the teacher about. The principal can turn to the teacher and say, boy, that Joey in that classroom was a squirrel. He was hard to keep focused, shiny object. He was off to the races. How do you work with Joey? Do you see how much better that is than a stupid checklist that just irritates the teacher? Do you see how it becomes authentic and real? It allows the principal and the teacher to talk as equals about how together they can move practice forward. It is a liberating kind of seeing instruction. Now, having said that, it isn't necessarily the best. The reason we have four kinds of seeing instruction is there are lots of ways to do things. If you think I just said observation is bad, I'm sorry. I don't mean that. I mean what I mean to say is observation generally is not liked by teachers, and there's no evidence it's effective. But you know what? Some people use it quite effectively. I know a principal who was actually National Principal of the Year for high schools 3 years ago. Her observation is her way of seeing instruction, but she has some interesting rules for it. It's not evaluative. And she also makes a point of going in and talking with the teacher in a non-directive, open way within 24 hours. She's developed a culture of trust in her school that people accept that. I know another principal who's very effective with walkthroughs, ties it to feedback, and it can be highly effective. But I think we've confused being an instructional leader with being in a classroom. And those are two separate things.
I
Being in a
love that.
classroom can be part of being an instructional leader, but it certainly isn't being an instructional leader. Does that track?
Yes. What I love about that is it reminds me of something someone said to me recently about the difference between motion and action. Just doing something doesn't mean that, or being in the setting or walking through the motions doesn't actually mean that you're purposefully accomplishing anything. And so I want to bring it back, Mark, to a couple of things that you said earlier. Um, One is you reminded me of a conversation I had with another guest on my show, Justin Bader, who wrote a book for Solution Tree called Now We're Talking. And you know Justin. And his work is also, he's pointed the same thing out to me, which is, well, there's no research that shows that walkthroughs make any meaningful effect on student outcomes. And so what I hear you saying is there is no substitute, and I'm going to use the word you used when you and I have corresponded. There is no substitute for conversation when it comes to improving teaching practice. So take us to that post walk through conversation, Mark. What does an effective post walk through conversation sound like in your experience?
Well, after a principal does a seeing instruction activity, whether it be observation, walkthrough, work with students, or the fourth one we use, which is called student learning supervision. After that happens, the SAM turns to the principal the next day and says, what follow-up do you want? And if the principal says they don't need any, the SAM says, how come? And that's kind of an important question because you want the principal to reflect on what was their purpose and what was the value of having been there. Then the principal is asked, if the principal says they do want to have follow-up, the principal is asked, which of the four kinds of feedback do you wish to give? Directive, non-directive, celebratory, or written? Then principal picks one of the four. So when you ask what's going to be effective, I think it's all about intentionality. What is the principal's intent? And you want to narrow that down so the feedback can be effective. Most teachers are quite puzzled after a conversation with their principal. This is kind of an interesting thing. And I've had principals actually test this assumption that I have, that this is a truism, that many teachers are kind of puzzled because principals oftentimes don't have clarity in what they're saying. For example, I don't know about you, but when I went to principal school, I was taught that if I was going to have a conversation with a teacher where I had to talk with them about something they might not like or something I want them to do that they're not doing, maybe I should say something nice to them first. I should talk to them about something that's complimentary. Did you have that experience when you were taught?
Yes, I've heard this before.
Yeah, you know what a psychologist would say about that? What in the world are you thinking? Because what you just did is you made whatever you were going to say that was nice irrelevant because they don't believe it. It's sort of like dropping the other shoe, right? I soften you up and then I do that. So you want to be focused on what it is you want to accomplish. And so if it's a celebratory conversation, then you need to say, that's what I'm going to do, and then just stick with that. That same psychologist would tell you that when you do that celebratory conversation, it's not going to be effective unless I get you to talk. I have to tell you a funny story. I have a Chicago principal when he first started doing SAMs. We have principals pick the kind of instructional descriptors or things they'd specifically like to do more of. And he picked celebratory feedback. And so he goes in and he does a celebratory conversation with a high school English teacher who was also the AFT president in his building, representative. And she stopped him midway and said, "What's the real reason we're having this conversation? Do I need my union rep?" And do you know what this brilliant principal said? He looked at her and said, "The reason we're having this conversation is I'm trying to get better as a principal. I think I need to pay attention and have conversations with you about things you're doing well." When we do a celebratory conversation, there's some rules. The first rule is it has to be authentic. Two, it has to be very specific. Third, you have to get the other person to talk. And fourth, you do not go to next steps. Why? Because you want to benefit from having this celebratory conversation. You know that if I say to a teacher, "I really liked how you engaged students in a particular lesson. The activity you did was very effective. Tell me about it. Where'd that idea come from?" And then I say, "How did you feel about how that worked?" "I was really impressed too." If I have the discipline to stop right there and say, "This was really cool. Congratulations. This is a real win for you," the chances of that teacher having or doing that same activity again increase fivefold, 5 times more likely. But if that teacher gets me off track by saying, "Yeah, that worked, but this didn't," and then I go to another thing they might try, I just negated the chances of that celebratory feedback conversation having the impact I'd like it to have. You just want it blackjack. Take your money and leave the table before you lose it. I mean, really, the whole idea of feedback there should be some intention behind it. Why am I giving this feedback? What's my intentionality here? What am I hoping will occur? Then stick with it. Think about how lonely it is to be a classroom teacher. You could just teach your very best lesson in your entire life. You could be on cloud nine. You can't walk into the staff meeting and say, "Hey, it was great. You should have seen me, guys." They would all say braggart. That same teacher often can't go home and say to their significant other, "It was great today. You should have seen me," because they get not another school story. A principal is in an incredibly powerful position to be able to see good and talk about it with the teacher. But for it to work, for celebratory feedback to work, it's got to be intentional and it has to follow those 4 rules. That's what we teach a SAM principle. First, pick the kind of feedback: directive, non-directive, celebratory, or written. Every principal then has a chart for every teacher in the building that time track, the tool they use when they're scheduling their work, gives them for the teachers they work with. And it breaks out every time they had any kind of seeing instruction activity, how much they did and when they did it. But it divides it out in those 4 kinds. And so if I'm your Sam, Will, and you tell me you're not getting anywhere with me, with a particular teacher, I would say, well, let's look and see what you've done with the teacher. Ah, it looks like you've done a lot of observation and a lot of walkthrough. Do you want to try one of the other two kinds of seeing instruction? Gosh, your feedback has all been non-directive. Do you need to be directive sometimes so you can say what your non-negotiables are? So, Will, I may have gone off to the races here about trying to answer your question.
This is what I
But
love so much about your work, Mark. You're the most scientific practitioner when it comes to, okay, I just asked you about conversation, and you just took one of the threads of the 4 ways you can communicate and just gave us such great feedback. But let me just pause for a couple of seconds for Principal Matters listeners who may not be familiar with the SAM process. In the work that you've created, you encourage every principal to have an accountability member on their staff that you call the SAM, who can provide follow-up questions, can help hold them accountable to their calendar, can encourage them to that next step. And so in that process, um, you encourage that principal in that follow-up meeting to let that person who they meet with regularly, could be their secretary, it could be a co-administrator, whoever that Sam is, to just ask that question. Well, how have you, what is the conversation you followed up with from that observation or that walkthrough? Was it a directive? Should it be directive, non-directive, celebratory, or written? Because as you say, no, there is no substitute for a conversation. So just observing is never going to be as impactful as observing with feedback. Um, I do want to switch gears, Mark, and come back to something else you've talked about, which I think is really helpful for me because as a former principal, I wish I had done this more, which is that engagement with students. So talk about where leaders can engage more in their work with students as a part of their time in classrooms.
Well, I would broaden it again to engage with students, period, but classrooms are one place. And so a work with students activity where you're going in to watch the teacher teach while you work with a student would be one example of that. Walkthrough can be an example of that too, where a principal stops and talks with a student, and many principals do that. But we tell you that SAM principals try to go beyond that. And they also try to flip some of their management work into instructional work. So I'll give you an example of that. Many SAM principals will start their morning if they're going to do a walkthrough with 4 tickets in their pocket. These tickets all say My Table Lunch. And they go into a classroom and they're there for 5 or 10 minutes doing a walkthrough. And they pick a student where they're really impressed with something the student was doing in terms of their learning behavior. And they don't say a word to the kid, they just put that ticket on their desk. And they go to another classroom and do the same thing. Lunchtime comes, principal has the only round table in the cafeteria. He's sitting there with these 4 kids who are all looking at him thinking, are we in trouble? And you know what he says, or she says? No, you're in good. You're in good because you were doing something when I was in your room watching your teacher teach that impressed me. What do you think it was? And then the principal kind of does 2 birds with 1 stone, gets to supervise in the lunchroom while he gets to have a really insightful conversation with 4 or 5 students who talk with the principal about their experience in that classroom. Now, here's the interesting thing. Principals who do this is a favorite activity of SAM principals, by the way, because 1, it's a lot of fun, but 2, you learn so much about what's actually happening in a classroom. Any principal who does this will tell you, you do that one time. The next time you go to a walkthrough, kids throughout the school sit up straight, pay attention, because you know what? Kids want attention. By the way, that was a high school class I just gave you the example for. It was not an elementary. Most people say, oh, that works in elementary, wouldn't work in high school. Of course it works in high school.
Mm-hmm.
People want to be noticed. They want to be valued. And having the principal get face time and have face time with principals is important. Want to hear another example like that a lot of principals do? This one's really fun. It's called tagging. Most principals like to say goodbye to their kids at the end of the day. Great idea. So you're standing out there, the kids are leaving. Here's what a SAM principal might do. I tag a kid. Hey, Will, do you have homework tonight? Do you, Will?
Yes.
Will, do you have homework tonight? Will,
Yes,
I'm asking you. Role play with me here, buddy. Do you have homework tonight?
Yes, I have homework tonight
What do you have it
in language arts.
Great. I want to see your homework tomorrow morning right here. Hey, Joey, do you have homework tonight? You do? Oh, you don't? Great. Then here's what I want you to do. I want you to find one word that you don't know the meaning of that's in print in your house. And I want you to talk with me about it tomorrow. You can find out the meaning ahead of time. That's extra. But I want to see that one word. Hey, Jose, do you have homework tonight? Oh, you do in math. Great. I want to see it here tomorrow morning. You know what the principal then does tomorrow morning? He has a student desk right there in the route, right there where he'd normally stand, a seat on each side, a chair on each side. When you come up, you show me your homework. I high five you, you go. If you hadn't done your homework, you know what the principal does? He says, no problem. Go to my office, get started on it, and I'll walk you to class as soon as I'm done here. Do you see how that has this impact for all of the kids, all of the adults who see the principal? And here's what it shows. It shows what the principal values. It also gives the principal insight into the classroom. When the Sam talks to the principal that day and says, did you do that with your duty this morning? And the principal says, yes. The Sam says, was any of it instruction? And in this case, part of it would be. And so they'd reconcile their time track. So it'd show the actual amount of instructional time instead of what was intended. Then the Sam asks a very important question. What follow-up do you want? Well, I think I want to go to Will's classroom. I want to go in and see how that works and what happens with the homework today. You see the connectivity here that's so important. Intentionality is what it's all about. And so having a principal engage with students is really important. And there's a secret reason why. I bet you know it, Will. Kids are a heck of a lot more fun to be around than the adults. They're easier to teach, they're easier to work with. So principals tend to gravitate toward those conversations because they're more fun. What we do in the SAM process is say, can't we leverage that connection with students to help the teacher do better? Want to know the biggest mistake I made as a principal and a superintendent, Will?
What was it?
It's also something I was proudest of. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. As a principal in an 800 student school, I taught an hour a day.
Mm.
I would say to the sixth grade teachers, when you do your reading groups, I'll do a group too, and I'll do it all year long. When I became a superintendent, I did the same thing. I would go to a school and say, what teacher could use an hour off each day for the next 9 weeks? I'll teach that class. I was so proud of it. As I matured and we started doing the SAM work, I thought, what an idiot I was. Why didn't I work with the teacher? Why didn't I work with the principal instead of when I was a superintendent going into the school and teaching a class? I thoroughly loved doing what I had done, teaching a class as an elementary principal, then being a superintendent and teaching and giving a teacher time off so I could teach their class. But I would have been far more effective if I had worked with the adults. So why didn't I? Because they're not as much fun. It's harder to teach an adult. Part of that's biological. We're hardwired to learn the younger we are, right? So we come into this world sponges, being able to learn stuff. As we get older, and it happens really fast, it doesn't mean you can't still learn things. You're just slower. The other issue that gets in the way of adult learning is ego. It doesn't bother the kindergartner. They don't know that Apple says ah. It drives the kindergarten teacher to distraction when the principal comes in and says, let me talk with you about a different way of teaching. Apple says ah. So really, when you think about it, nobody has as hard a job in a school as a school principal. School principals don't want to say that, but you know what? It's absolutely true.
It is true, and you've said it to me before, and I've talked to so many leaders, Mark, who have been in the role of a teacher, principal, superintendent, and even my superintendent friends will tell me there's no role as hard as being the principal. And our listeners to the show, whether they're newer leaders or veteran leaders, I know they're benefiting from all these stories. And I just want to say this out loud because it's been almost 20 years since you've been doing the same process. I think, is this year 19?
24.
Oh my gosh, are you serious?
We'll have our 19th annual conference this year in Fort Lauderdale, where
Yeah.
principals come in and they get pushed by people like you. You're one of the keynote speakers this year. But we actually started the SAM process prior to that. The Wallace Foundation funded our work for 8 years doing research on whether or not this crazy idea that my wife and I had, that you could change the culture in a school where a principal could spend the majority of the day doing instructional leadership work. Yeah, it's been a while.
Wow. And the reason I bring that up is because Mark, I've had the privilege of being in the room with you and with other leaders, and you've never stopped being a sponge of learning and taking these ideas that you've had, that you've watched enhance the work of, and I'm not just saying this to make you feel good or make leaders, um, I bring guests on this show because I really am curious and I love good practice. But I work with leaders and get to coach leaders now who also use your process. Some of them are like part of, they go to your conferences. Others have adapted your processes informally, but they've used them. And I've watched, Mark, the same things that you're describing, um, the difference that gets made with this kind of intentionality around feedback and communication with students and with teachers, which leads to this next question. You emphasize student learning behavior as a focus area for leaders. Can you explain how this practice helps teachers better engage students and what leaders can learn from doing it?
Sure. When a principal is working with their SAM during the day and planning out what they're going to do the next day, and if the principal wants to see a teacher teach, he can pick one of the four choices in terms of kinds. And I mentioned it before: observation, walkthrough, work with students. And the last one is student learning supervision. Student learning supervision is when the principal goes into the room with intentionality to assist the teacher in helping students attend, pay attention, be good student learners. Okay. You don't do that as being an aid for the teacher ongoing. Instead, you're going in for the intentional, with the intent of learning how to help the teacher do it better by assisting the teacher during the time. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
During a SAM training, oftentimes the SAM is a school secretary. I'll turn to this group and say, secretaries, do any of you have a teacher who sends kids to the office like a freight train right about lunchtime? And they all laugh because they all have one. And I say, great. As a SAM, what you say to your principal is you say, Madam Principal, did you know that Mark sends kids to the office like a freight train from his fourth grade class every day at about 11:15 right before lunch? I didn't know that, says the teacher, the principal. And then the SAM says, how about if I schedule you for that special kind of seeing instruction, student learning supervision? You can go in and assist with the student learning behavior so you can figure out then how to help the teacher do it better. Teacher principal says yes. The SAM says, great, I'll put you in there for the next 3 days. Then I'll set you up with the instructional coach. The two of you can talk about how to teach Mark to do it better. And then you can teach him. What do you think? The whole idea here is never to have it be punitive, but instead, how can you have things be formative? How can you help the person get better? And having the specificity of breaking out what the principal is doing, not just between instructional and management activities in the building, which are important, by the way. You can't ignore the management. You have to learn to manage the management in order to do the instructional work. But the purpose of dividing out specifically what you're doing is to give you data so you can be reflective. Reflection is something that benefits everybody, and getting the principal to have to stop and think about intentionality and impact is really important. One of my favorite things I see principals do once they hit their stride doing the SAM process is they'll call the teacher in and say, here's a chart showing all the time I've spent with you so far this year. If you were going to have me do something I'm not doing on this chart, what would it be? What would you like me to do more of? What would you like me to do less of? It's amazing how often, if you ask someone you want to help, what would help, you get really good information. But you have to be brave. I know one principal in California who said that to a teacher and said, all this stuff you do when you're in my room and you sit in the back of the room and you write, get rid of that. All that time you walk in my room, get rid of that. I don't want any of that. And the principal, I mean, that's kind of harsh to hear, isn't it? The principal looked at the person and said, well, what would you like? I'd like you to co-teach with me. Okay, nice invitation. Is there something I can do short of co-teaching? Well, you could come in and you could help this group. I work with students. So it's kind of interesting by just asking another person what would help. In many SAM schools, once the principal's doing well, the way we're structured as a nonprofit, then we provide service to an assistant principal or instructional coach. They get their own time tracks and the data merges together. And so those are fascinating meetings because then you have a principal, you have an instructional coach, you have an AP, and maybe you have a counselor. They all have data showing their work with an individual teacher. I saw a school in Tampa, Florida, actually, it was right before the pandemic. And I went in, it's a big school like they have in Florida, thousands of students. It's an elementary, it has almost 3,000 students. And in the school, there were 6 time track users, and they were all kind of wringing their hands about the fact they weren't getting anywhere with the 3rd grade. There were 8 third grade teachers. They brought the 8 third grade teachers in, they merged their data, they showed the 3rd grade teachers, and they said, if we were helpful, how would this look different? What would we be doing? How would these charts look different? And boy, did those 3rd grade teachers tell them. And to their credit, those school leaders were open to that. I love this stuff.
I love this stuff too, Mark, because you are such a great teacher of reflective practice. And you know my work too, which is a cycle of trying to learn to be curious, learn, take action, reflect, refine. And that's the cycle of every great classroom. And what you invite leaders to do is take that same learning cycle that works for every student, whoever learns anything exceptional, and apply it to the way that you interact with teachers, apply it to the way that you interact with students. Um, Mark, I don't I know when you and I are going to see each other next. We're recording this in the fall, although because of my show's recordings being so scheduled so far in advance, listeners won't hear this until probably the spring. And you and I are going to get to be together in the winter. So I get some opportunities to connect with you more often than my listeners do. But how can they find you? And if they want to invite this process into their own work, or if they want to attend one of your trainings, tell listeners how they can stay connected with you and any parting words of advice.
Well, if you're interested in SAMS, you can go to samsprocess.com online or nationalsams.com, either one, and you'll find a lot of information. Keep in mind, we're a nonprofit. Well, we do have some rules. We'll only work with you if you want to. So your superintendent can't say you have to do it. You also have full control over your data. We're really careful about that. If you're going to do the SAM process, look and see and make sure it's something you really want to do, because it does require some discipline and a different way of doing things. I had one high school principal in New York City tell me once, if I would have known I had to change, I never would have signed up for this. And I looked at him, I said, I'm really impressed that you said that. I thought that was really actually very reflective. And he said, but I did promise I'd do it and I'll stick with it. And he did. And he said he'd only stick with it through the 1 year because that's our deal. If you start SAMS, you got to do it for the year. We won't leave you alone. Because we don't just train you. We then have an implementation specialist who joins your SAM daily meeting via Zoom or any online platform you want every day for about 2 to 3 weeks until you're doing well. And then we have a coach who works with you. So anyhow, that principal I was telling you in New York, that first year he said, I'll do my commitment. I'll do it to the end of the year. About 3/4 of the way through the year, Will, he called me and said, guess where I am? I said, I don't know. Where are you? He said, it's 5 o'clock and I'm helping my wife make dinner. I've never been able to do that with my wife and 2 twin sons ever. That was 7 or 8 years ago. He still does SAMS. SAMS is not very prescriptive. There are 4 things you have to do. You have to schedule your work ahead of time at or above a goal you set. You have to have a SAM daily meeting where a reflective practice partner we train, usually a secretary, a counselor, has to be somebody you trust, assistant principal, somebody like that. We train that person to take you through a 15 to 30 minute session where you talk about your work and your next steps and the impact you're having. That's the second non-negotiable. The third is you have to use your data to be even more effective than you already are. And lastly, you have to work with your coach and your specialist. Other than that, we leave it up to the principal. And you know why. Each principal is held totally accountable for what happens in their school, right? Well, then they should be given the freedom to make the decision of what they're most effective at doing. If I could change one thing about being a superintendent for 10 years, it would be not to have been as directive as I tended to be, but instead allowing the person you're working with, the people you're working with, to think through what would be most effective for them is far more effective in the end in terms of your mission and vision.
You have to learn to manage the management to do the instructional leadership. I'm just quoting you back, Mark. And Principal Matters listeners, if you are interested in digging deeper, you need to go to samsprocess.com or nationalsams.com, or just go to the show notes for today's show at my website at williamdparker.com, and I'll have a link to Mark and all of his wonderful work. Mark, what an honor to get to be in the room with you again. Thank you for the work that you've done. And I'm not just saying this to be nice, because I know so many leaders whose ability to go home and cook with their wife and children has happened because they've learned to manage their management so they can do this work. So thank you so much for what you've given to leaders and the work that you've done. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, would you take a moment and like, share, subscribe, or leave us a review? In fact, if you share it out with a friend, even more people can become a part of these conversations. Sign up for our newsletter at williamdparker.com for even more free resources. And don't forget to check out our website to learn more about our books, professional development offerings, Grow Academies, masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations. Wow, let's keep learning together. And thank you for doing what matters.
Principal Matters.